Hi, hello there. Yes, I'm talking to you. Since you're here watching this video about markers and colored pencils, it's a pretty good bet that you're looking for useful advice on how to color better. You've watched lots of free videos, but have you ever noticed that some marker tutorials work while others don't? Like you follow along and you do everything they say to do. And with some videos, your coloring turns out exactly like what you see on screen. And then other times, you fail miserably. If you're anything like me, sometimes you blame the video. That person did not explain things well enough. Maybe they didn't show everything, or maybe they skipped some of the important parts. But I know that most of the time, we blame ourselves. That person is really talented and we're not, so of course their coloring looks better than ours. Hang on a minute though. Did you ever think that maybe the problem isn't the tutorial and it's also not your fault? Today, let's talk about the totally innocent misunderstanding, which explains why some tutorials are amazing and other ones are just eh. Okay, let's do a pop quiz. What size is this project? Is it 3 inches tall? Is it 6 inches? 12 inches? How big is this project? Now, hang on. We're 2 minutes into this video, and you don't know what size it is? That's a pretty important detail, and you don't know. Why not? Size matters in every aspect of our daily lives. You probably don't live in an 8-bedroom house if it's just you and your cat. You don't buy size 2 jeans for your size 18 butt. And if the recipe says 2 cups of flour, you don't use 12. But somehow we drop all sense of size and proportion when we're watching coloring tutorials. Some of you are hearing about this for the first time ever, and you're like smacking yourself in the forehead because this should have been obvious, and yet you never thought about it. Videos and blogs, just the internet in general, we don't do a good job of indicating size. Is this a big line drawing, or is this a little line drawing? Nobody knows. And even when the video makes a point to tell you the size, we have a tendency to ignore it. Think about it. When was the last time that you looked at the size of the project they're coloring and compared it to the size of the paper or the size of the sketchbook? When have you ever looked closely at the marker and their hand and then calculated how large their coloring is? You don't, because we're biased. We assume that everyone colors at the same size that we do. So the card makers watching today's video, you just naturally figure this rose is small enough to fit on a greeting card. The sketchbook fans, you guess that this rose could be a 2-page spread in a 10-inch book. And I have the bad habit of thinking that everything is frameable for over my couch. We just assume, and that's not good. Tutorials only work at a specific size. See, people are so worried about owning the right markers in the correct colors. They're super focused on using the best blending combination. And then getting all the shade and the highlight colors into the perfect places to create depth and dimension. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. You should be thinking about all that stuff. But what you're not thinking about is ultimately the reason why you keep feeling like a doofus when the tutorial doesn't work. The most important part of the tutorial isn't the color they're using or where they put the color. The thing you're missing is how to apply the color. And that how changes with the size of every project. What you're watching here is footage from Rosie Gets the Blues. It's one of my intermediate level classes. Because it's an intermediate level class, we're coloring this rose on a medium-sized, middle-level 6-inch piece of paper. If we colored the rose smaller, the project would be harder. And if we doubled the size of the rose, it would also be harder. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but the thing that you always have to keep in mind is that we're working with markers here. If we were painting this rose with paint, we could use a teeny tiny paintbrush and paint a teeny tiny rose. Or we could choose a larger brush and paint the same rose to fill the side of a building. Different size brushes give you a lot of flexibility. But we're not that lucky. We're stuck with this, and this only comes in one size. So now that you think about it, it stands to reason that there's an ideal size project for this size nib. Any project that exceeds the ideal size is going to get harder. Any project that's below the ideal size will be trouble. Because we can't change the size of the brush nib, we have to change the only thing that we can change, the application technique. And that's why you strike out so often using free online tutorials. See, a card maker or a stamper might already have a small rose stamp, so you'd use that instead of the tutorial image. And a marker sketcher, you might draw a rose to fill a full journal page, which is all great, but then you can't follow my instructions for coloring this 5-inch rose. You're changing the size of the project, but you're trying to use the original size technique. And it doesn't work. Not because you're stupid, but because it doesn't work. We've all seen these questions posted on Reddit or in marker groups on Facebook, and maybe you've asked the question yourself.
Hey, why is my background really streaky?
Or maybe it's,
I drew this big penguin, but I can't get the body smooth.
And you'll see people giving all kinds of advice in the comments.
Get a different brand of marker, buy better paper, refill your marker, use the brush nib, no, use the chisel nib.
When really, the answer is that the project is just too darn big for the technique you're using. On the flip side, there's a ton of card makers out there who don't like brush nibs, and they've replaced them all with smaller bullet nibs. But now you're mad because bullet nibs are really bad for blending. Again, it's not the marker. It never was the marker. You're using the wrong technique for the size of your project. The point of a brush nib is actually smaller than a bullet nib. But you would never know this if you're constantly taking advice from videos where they color really large projects using big, long strokes. If you're coloring small, you need to use small techniques. Get up onto the tip of your brush nib. Be a ballerina. Color on point. And reduce the number of markers in your blending combination. Most stamps, they barely have room for one marker. If you try and fill the space with 3 or 4 colors, of course it's going to look over-inked or bleed outside the lines. Oh, and speed up, too. You think that moving slowly helps you to be more accurate, but really, you're just flooding the paper with way too much ink. The smaller the image, the more light, delicate, and fast your technique should be. You can color a small rose. You just need to be smart about it. Use small techniques for small spaces. The tutorial for a 10-inch rose will not work for you, and you're going to feel clumsy, all thumbs, like you're a no-talent failure every time you try. The side of a brush nib is larger and juicier than you realize, and you'll never know to use the side of your nib if you're constantly taking advice from teeny tiny coloring videos where they choke up on the marker and make teeny tiny strokes. Large coloring requires large techniques. If you've ever been given the bad advice to color in those small circular strokes, that's the sign of someone who's using tiny techniques to color big, large spaces. There's an easier way to do this, folks. Hold the marker way back here, which puts you down onto the broad side of your brush nib. and get your arm and wrist off the desk. Gluing your arm to the desk is for teeny tiny colorers. If you're coloring large, you need to move your whole arm. And remember a second ago when I told the tiny colorers to reduce the number of markers in their blending combination? Well, large spaces need more markers. Smooth, even coverage happens when you use 3 to 4 layers of ink. The more markers in your blending combination, the easier it is to get 4 layers of ink onto the paper. And slowing down helps too. Large projects require a lot of ink. Slowing down and making long, large, lazy strokes is much more efficient. You can color a large rose. You just can't use teeny tiny tutorials. By the way, since you're now going to start paying attention to size, you'll probably notice something. Small colors can't get away with murder. It's easier to keep small spaces wet, so even if their blending technique is kind of primitive, well, because they're blending wet into an already wet area, they can get some pretty good blends using terrible technique. And a lot of small colorers don't realize it's bad technique because for them, it works. But then they teach it to you and you color larger, and it's no wonder you think blending is hard. Small technique looks really bad at large size. In my experience, and this is just a generalization, but from what I've noticed, the people who can color large can also easily adapt to coloring smaller. It's not even adapting because, even the largest images have some small spaces. Let's just say that large image people are a little more versatile, but the small peeps have a really hard time scaling upwards. And actually, a lot of the students who come to me for marker lessons, they've been coloring for a long time, but really, really small. They're having to relearn everything to color larger, and they have to break some of those bad habits that they've developed. To be fair, if you always and forever stick to that 2-inch image, it's fine to use whatever technique you want. But to me, it's going to be harder for you to learn versatile techniques from small colorists. So if you're watching small videos, borrow the inspiration, just maybe not the technique. I've seen some great tutorials online, both in video format and on some of the older blogs. Like there's long articles with step-by-step instructions and process photos. But even the best tutorial in the world is guaranteed to fail every time if you're not matching the size of your project to the size of their project. Techniques have sizes. Match the techniques to the size of your coloring, and you can color anything. Your projects will look great. You'll be unstoppable. Oh, one more tip. As you start to pay more attention to the size of the coloring in videos, be aware. There's a difference between project size and cell size. So the size of my rose here may be 5 inches tall, but it's not one big 5-inch shape. The cells which make up the rose are actually pretty small. And this is why it's easy to color really big mandalas, because they're just a series of small cells. Professional marker artists are very good at breaking big images into small, manageable cells. We know the limits of our markers, and frankly, we know the limits of our marker skills. So we don't create uncolorably large images, and we don't color 10-inch wide uninterrupted backgrounds. Just remember to look at more than the overall size of the project in the video. Also pay attention to the size of the cells. The video could be showing a small technique on a large image. You've got to be smart about this stuff. Stop assuming that the world colors at your favorite size. Chances are, we're not. For more information on Rosie Gets the Blues, see the resource link in the description. And for more tips on coloring tiny images, I try to color really, really small here.